By all accounts, reports coming out from the current front lines that Russia are encountering over 1,000 casualties a day. It's worse than Bakhmut, and they're still not making significant progress. The reason I mention all of that is that Russia is trying everything it can to push forward during this remaining window of opportunity when it's got Ukraine on the back foot, targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, targeting their industry, targeting the airfields, targeting the Ukrainian front line, are all part of what Russia is trying to do. And of course, whilst the weather's nice, satellites work, you can see down, you can target, and therefore you'd expect to see an intensification of Russian attacks. And I think that's what we're seeing.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio. I'm James Henderson, and today we're once again talking about the latest on the war in Ukraine, and I'm delighted to be joined by a regular guest here on Frontline, former fighter pilot, military analyst and co-host of the Red Matrix podcast, Sean Bell. Sean, always a pleasure. Welcome back.
Hey James, lovely to be here again.
Let's start with the awful events of yesterday. The deadly missile strikes on not just Kyiv, but other Ukrainian towns and cities. What did you make of it? I mean, we have seen horrific bombardments of Ukraine ever since the full-scale invasion of 2022, but this felt of a different scale.
Yes, it did, and we'll come on to the specific reason for that in a minute. We've got to remember we're in the middle of a pretty brutal war. Russia is determined to try to prevail. It knows that Ukraine's industry is starting to spin up, that their defence industrial base, they're trying to develop 1 million drones, and drones are being particularly effective against Russia at the moment. Russia's also been attacking airfields, trying to wipe out the Ukrainian Air Force, probably as a warning if the F-16s arrive later this summer as they're expected. But I think the real shock yesterday was the targeting of that children's hospital in Kyiv. And I know the danger is that we're in the middle of an information war at the moment. And so it would suit Ukraine to say it was deliberately targeted. Russians have already come out with a whole load of different contradictory lines about what happened. Now, I'm an old, wizened, grey-haired military guy. I know that sometimes your air defence missiles, when they shoot down a missile, the wreckage, the explosive can fall anywhere and cause damage. But the beauty about the middle of Kyiv is there are lots of video cameras, and I've studied a bit of footage of the missile going into that children's hospital. And I have to say, first of all, it does not look like a missile that's been shot down. There's no damage to it. It looks absolutely one of the KH-101 cruise missiles used by Russia. It looks to be on its terminal path into its intended target, and that's the one that struck the children's hospital. Now, quite why that was targeted, because it's against every known international law, Geneva Convention or whatever, and it's, and a dreadful, dreadful tragedy for Ukraine, particularly the children there. But I say at face value, I cannot see still from a military perspective why Russia would deliberately target a hospital. But I have to say the evidence suggests it was their missile that went in on a trajectory. It wasn't damaged, and that's what it hit. So you have to follow the dots and conclude that Russia, for whatever reason, is extending this sort of carnage into the civilian population.
Because the Kremlin, as you say, have long claimed, pretty baselessly it must be said, but have long claimed that they don't target civilian infrastructure. But you're pretty clear that not just, on many occasions during the war, but on this occasion in particular, this very much was a target, a deliberate target of civilian infrastructure.
Well, I'm not sure I'd quite go that far because, again, I struggle intellectually to work out why Russia would do that. In the middle of winter, it targets energy infrastructure because it wants to make the morale of the Ukrainian people at a low. They just don't want to fight anymore. If you target a hospital with children in, I'm pretty sure that just hardens the resolve of Ukrainians to fight to the end. It's also pretty clear Russia is pretty short of missiles. It's been buying them in from Iran, from North Korea. It desperately needs to target energy infrastructure, the developing industry, airfields, the front line. And it's been pretty well documented, particularly from some of the more sensitive briefings, that Russia, just like Ukraine, is struggling to keep pace with the demands of the frontline war. And therefore, why would you use a missile to deliberately target something like a hospital? But having read the lines that come out from Russia on this particular occasion, As I say, the normal remnants of missiles falling down into residential areas. I accept that's part of. You've got to put an air defense umbrella up over Ukraine. You are going to have some explosive falling down on casualties. But I have to say, having looked at that video, that's not a doctored video. And if you look at the identification signs of that missile, that is a KH-101. It's not been damaged. It is on its final trajectory. And therefore, unless the Russians have misaimed it, then you have to conclude that it's hit its intended target. And that is a tragedy. And I think the International Court of Justice, all of the international bodies will be looking at that for evidence for after the end of the war, because it's very difficult to see how that is a justifiable act of war. Very difficult indeed.
And of course, it wasn't just the missile attack on Kyiv. There were attacks on Dnipro and on Kryvyi Rih and on Pokrovsk and I think other areas as well. So it was a it seemed to be a concerted series of attacks on Ukraine. The timing, some people have suggested that's significant because obviously we've got the NATO summit beginning. Do you think the timing would have been deliberate?
Nothing that Russia does is ever done by happenstance. But I do think we need to set the context for this. A year ago, James, you and I were talking about the sort of much anticipated spring offensive, which of course was delayed till the summer. Ukraine really didn't make much progress then. This year, because of the delay in getting weapons and arms into Ukraine, you remember that 60 billion that was held up in the US Congress, and it's just been unlocked, but it takes a while to get the weapons in. And Russia undoubtedly is capitalizing on that window of opportunity to try to drive forward, take advantage of Ukrainian weakness and make progress. And all the way along the front line, Russia is on the front foot. It's not making the progress that it would have wanted. And that will probably be immensely frustrating for President Putin, because he knows that once the full weight of Western weapons arrive, Russia will be subject to a pretty intensive attack. And it's also worth noting that, do you remember the battle for Bakhmut, which was particularly bloody last year? 30,000 lives lost. Now, at the peak of that, it was described as the most bloody war since World War II, or the most bloody battle since World War II. There were about 800 to 900 casualties a day in there. By all accounts, reports coming out from the current front lines that Russia are encountering over 1,000 casualties a day. It's worse than Bakhmut, and they're still not making significant progress. The reason I mention all of that is that Russia is trying everything it can to push forward during this remaining window of opportunity when it's got Ukraine on the back foot, targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure, targeting their industry, targeting the airfields, targeting the Ukrainian front line, are all part of what Russia is trying to do. And of course, whilst the weather's nice, satellites work, you can see down, you can target, and therefore you'd expect to see an intensification of Russian attacks. And I think that's what we're seeing.
And I suppose what it illustrates once again, and I'm sure this will come up at the NATO summit, and we'll come on to talk about that in detail in a moment, is the desperate need for new air defences in Ukraine.
Well, that was definitely the priority when President Zelensky appealed to President Joe Biden, that said once that number was unlocked, logistics takes a while to get this stuff forward. Now, there's no doubt the US would have lent into this slightly. They'd have forward deployed some weapons waiting for the signatory, and off you go. But President Zelensky's been very clear that Patriot has been top of his wish list. But of course, the problem with Patriot is it may be a fantastic weapon, but it's $2 or $3 million a pop. You can't use it to target everything. And therefore, it's layered air defenses. That's what Ukraine's been desperately needing. Plus, of course, the ability to strike Russia in the rear areas, which has been the very topical news. But air defense is definitely a priority. And that's why Russia's been pounding across the country. And although Ukraine does appear to have shot down quite a lot of the missiles coming in, inevitably some get through.
And just on the Patriot missile systems, I mean, there is a lengthy queue of countries around the world who would like Patriot missile systems. And yes, okay, Ukraine probably needs them more than anyone else. But, people are looking after their own air defense supplies. People are anxious about making sure that they've got enough air defenses. If you're in Eastern Europe, you think, well, hang on a minute, we need them too. You've got countries all over the world who are trying to get their hands on the same air defense systems.
Yeah, there's a couple of points there. One of which, if you were the manufacturers of the Patriot system, you'd be rubbing your hands in glee. There is a phenomenal export opportunity for the US companies involved, and they've ramped up production no end. The trick, of course, is that, and we'll probably discuss this later as well, is that you don't want to let your most modern technology go into the hands of the Ukrainians, because inevitably some of these weapons do fall into the hands of the Russians. You don't want to give all your secrets away. And therefore, technology has largely been the West's asymmetric advantage in these wars. That's why we're supporting Ukraine, but we have to support them with slightly older equipment, and therefore trying to make sure the right standard of Patriot missile system finds its way into the hands of the Ukrainians is really important. But the point is this, that a lot of European countries are making sacrifices, putting equipment forward, almost certainly on the basis that America said, you put your equipment forward to Ukraine, we'll backfill it with slightly more modern systems. And that's probably the way to actually keep the supplies increasing, but providing Ukraine with the weapons of the quality that NATO and the US particularly is happy for them to have.
On the topic of equipment falling into enemy hands, Russia claims to have captured a British Storm Shadow missile. If that is true, how significant is that, Sean?
Well, first of all, I don't think they've captured a missile. What I think they've done is they've found the wreckage of a missile. Capturing a missile would be a pretty, a couple of tons worth of, and you'd be taking a screwdriver and undoing it. I don't think that's the case. I think what they've done is they found the remains of a Storm Shadow missile. Now, the why that's important is because you can start to reverse engineer to work out what it can do, what its capabilities are. And once you know that, you can work out how to counter it. So, yes, it is quite alarming. And there's a couple of big buts here, one of which is most modern technology, it's not about the hardware. I'm looking at you through a computer. The hardware itself is relatively simple. The software is where the real capability lies. And of course, you can't get hold of the software once the thing has been smashed, destroyed. It's automatically expunged. So that's something they won't be able to get their hands on. Secondly, the Storm Shadows we gave to Ukraine are about 30 years old. We had, I won't get the numbers exactly right, but we bought about 1 million of these about 30 years ago, about $2 billion, so about 2 million a pop. We've used about just over 100 of them. We're going to upgrade some. We are upgrading, some of them at the moment, but we don't need 900. We're only going to upgrade a few hundred. That left a few that were available, old. We either paid industry to decommission them, or we paid industry to destroy them, or to store them, or we gave them to Ukraine to use. And actually, given their 30-year-old technology, it might not sound long, but James, you barely look 30. And if I was to look back at my mobile phone technology, 30 years ago, these really didn't exist. They were massive bricks. So you just imagine the level of technology that's actually in that missile. It's not a worry for us that we lose that sort of technology, because if that's a value to the Russians, then really are in a bad way.
On the topic of technology, the Russian Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin has called for Russia to increase domestic production of drones fivefold by 2030. I suppose that raises the question of how central is drone warfare going to be, not just to the future of this conflict, but to the future of war more generally?
I think that's one of the big questions of our time, James. I mean, I remember thinking back to, the Gulf War. We started to see these Reapers and the like, long-range unmanned vehicles that, frankly, could keep an eye on a bad guy for 24 hours. My bladder wouldn't last that long, so sat in the cockpit of my jet. I'm very glad we had an unmanned aircraft to do that. And we really dismissed anything smaller as being toys. I think what we've seen in this war, a huge explosion in the utility of these things, because largely, we get seduced by them carrying weapons and suicide drones. But actually, the advent of technology has meant things like cameras, things like infrared cameras, synthetic aperture radars, sensors have become much smaller, much lighter, and therefore can be carried on these drones. And we're seeing them be used in a whole variety of different ways. Also, as we've said, I think we've said before, you see these swarms of drones. They provide some fantastic beautiful imagery. I think at Disney they're showing a big display of these light. But imagine each of those had a hand grenade on them, and they were synchronized to fly through a window and go through every room of a building. It's horrendous, and I do think there's a whole new world out there now. The one caveat I would say about Russia's claim is that it's one thing to build lots of drones. It's like building aircraft. The drone is only one part of it. The real part of it is the technology you mount on the drone. Yes, you've got to make the drone light, they're powered and stuff like that. But then it's these sensors and it's technology that Russia has never been particularly far forward with. And I think, yes, they'll be able to put high explosive on these little drones, fly them in suicide. That's a big worry. But in terms of generating the technological advances to make these drones really, really important in this next generation of warfare, I think Russia might struggle.
Let's come on to the NATO summit happening in Washington from today. Ukraine, of course, you would expect to dominate conversation. Specifically, what do you think will be the key talking points around Ukraine there?
Yeah, it's the 75th anniversary, isn't it, of NATO out in Washington. I think there'll be a lots of sort of reflections on why NATO was formed, its journey, and where it finds itself today. Because you only have to go back a few years and people will start to talk about, is this the end of NATO? Has it just become a talking shop in the middle of the Cold War? Has it lost its mojo? Whereas now it feels more powerful than ever. New nations joining, all 32 will be represented there. The slight worry, I think, is that whilst, as you say, Ukraine probably will be number one on the agenda, what I think will be a real concern, if you look through the papers, it'll be the age, the distraction of President Biden that I think will be a major distraction. And why is that the case? Why should it matter? Well, I think our leaders ultimately, Joe Biden is the commander-in-chief of the most powerful military force in the world. And I think when you come to a NATO summit, that brings it all into sharp contrast. It's not just about being an effective team, all being seen around a table, waving a flag and having a drink together. It's being able to have a credible military capability with decisive individuals in core leadership roles that are really clear thinking about what the threat is and what the reaction needs to be, because that's all part of the deterrence. It's not big D deterrence nuclear, it's small d, the credibility of our collective capabilities. And I think that unfortunately will be a disturbing side issue, particularly because President Trump is sort of waiting in the wings. And we've all seen some of the headlines around where he might take NATO. But I think for me, it isn't just about Ukraine. It's going to be also about, I'm old enough that I joined the military in the Cold War. We had massive military exercises. We had tactical evaluations every 2 weeks or so. We did large scale practices. Today, people talk about large scale. It's not. We would have called what happens today really small scale. And how do you scale up that experience and expertise onto the global stage? It's not like just turning a knob up. The Cold War finished 34 years ago. Most military careers are about 35 years long. So the last people who have any experience whatsoever of that scale of preparedness, of command and control, the issues of scale, have now left the military. And I think that's true not just of our nation, it's true of NATO, all of the nations. So I think, how do you regenerate NATO to be ready and credible for the demands of not wars of choice, but now wars of national survival, credible threats against our borders? That needs a very different response. And I think that'll probably be top of the agenda at NATO.
And how much of that, Sean, fundamentally comes down to defence budgets? I mean, only today in the UK, you've got the former head of the army calling on the new Prime Minister in the UK, Keir Starmer, to increase defence spending to 3% of GDP. You've had only last week, I think it was, countries in the east of NATO calling on France and Germany to do the same. Do we have to accept, particularly if there is the risk of Donald Trump and America becoming more isolationist, that NATO countries in Europe have to spend more on defence?
Well, again, James, I'd go back to history. When I joined the military, pre-Cold War, we were routinely spending 4, maybe 5% in the earlier days because the threat warranted that. And it feels to me a more dangerous world than it has been for some time. It feels that we've got the rise of major players who are threatening European security. And therefore, we dropped our budget down towards 2% because we enjoyed the peace dividend, post-Cold War peace dividend. Actually, we're not in that space anymore. So I think there's an inevitability that if we're going to pay the insurance premium for our national security, the cost of that premium is rising. And I don't know what the number is, but what we've got to avoid doing, though, is giving ministers, governments, an opportunity just to throw more money at defence. I honestly believe that is not the answer. It is about what does this new world order look like? How do we have to change the way we do defence? What's the role of our national capability versus our role in alliances? And that is different, because if you wanted to play a role in a 32-man alliance, we might focus, I'm being flippant now, on only providing one pillar of that military capability, but doing it really, really well, but leaving us a bit void in other areas. That would be a very good team player, but wouldn't give us much national capability. There's a really interesting debate. And also how much you invest in new technologies like drone warfare, rather than just being about ships, tanks and aeroplanes. And I think the worry is if you leave it just to the military, we do tend to revert to ships, tanks and aeroplanes, big projects, count them out. Whereas quantity these days does have a quality all of its own. I think some really interesting questions that we as a nation need to answer.
Something that we probably haven't discussed enough in the UK over recent weeks and months is that we've now got we know who's going to be the new Secretary General of NATO. It's going to be Mark Rutte, who until recently was the long-serving Prime Minister of Netherlands, quite a respected figure within Europe, replacing Jens Stoltenberg, of course, who's been the Secretary General of NATO for a long time. How significant will that change of leadership be? Because Stoltenberg has been a big player, and Mark Rutte has got a massive job on his hands.
He has, and if you remember, Jens Stoltenberg was extended by a couple of years because they didn't want the NATO Sec General changing at such an unsettling time for NATO. But as the years have rolled on, they've decided it is time to change. Really big shoes to fill. I think what I like about the Mark Rutte piece, though, is that in the Netherlands, his role has been to try to manage a sort of disparate audience. He's had to manage a coalition. There's no one party. So he's had to be a very good diplomat, to have to work the room to try and build consensus. And that's all about what NATO's about. It's not about individual nations. So I think his core DNA, his long-standing experience as Prime Minister there will stand him in very good stead. And also, I do think at times we might, bemoan somebody moving on. But in my experience, as a chartered director, every 9 years, you should be moving on anyway, because you need fresh ideas, you need fresh input. It feels to me that over the last few years, the role of NATO has changed fundamentally. And actually, the role of preparedness, how you tackle this imbalance between Europe and the US, how do we make sure all of the members of NATO can benefit from the security umbrella it provides, but also pay their way. And I think there's some really interesting challenges. And Mark Rutte's probably got a fresh perspective in it all. And he certainly has the skills to do the job. So it'll be really interesting to see just how well he does.
Do you expect the issue of a potential future Ukrainian membership of NATO to be a big feature over the coming days?
Well, in a way, I hope not. And I'll explain why. Whether you believe it or not, but one of the reasons that President Putin's justified going into Ukraine is that he didn't want to see NATO arrive on its doorstep. And what we know, NATO is a defensive alliance, but from Russian perspective, it might see it as the enemy. At some stage, there'll need to be some form of negotiated settlement to end the war in Ukraine. And one of the things Ukraine will want is a guarantee of security of its borders. Now, one of the ways of doing that is to join NATO, but I'd be pretty surprised if President Putin does everything he can to take that off the table. And the danger is if we make Ukraine joining of NATO as a fundamental tenet, the danger is we may inadvertently be extending the war in Ukraine because we are effectively saying to Russia that that's no longer an option. There are lots of ways that Europe could guarantee the borders of Ukraine without it necessarily being a member of NATO. And besides, Ukraine is not going to be able to join NATO anytime soon. So I think it might be unhelpful to have an overt public discussion about that, because inevitably that will only inflame President Putin.
I suppose the counter argument to that, though, is that the reason Putin wouldn't want Ukraine in NATO is because then he can have a second bite of the cherry down the line.
No, I agree entirely. And that's why I say, James, I think there are other ways for Europe to ensure security. For example, I'm not saying the United Nations will be able to play a role, but if the UK, the US, Germany, France were to put military bases into Ukraine, that wouldn't be part of NATO, but it would augment Ukraine's military capability and make sure that an attack on Ukraine would suddenly be more complicated for President Putin. NATO isn't the only answer, and the danger of playing that card too early is that it potentially makes it more difficult to find a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine.
And just finally, Sean, we've seen in recent weeks and months both Viktor Orban of Hungary, but also Xi Jinping of China try to cast themselves almost in the role as a potential mediator in any peace negotiations down the line. Do you think either of them could be credible in that role?
Yeah, they have two very different beasts, aren't they? Xi Jinping, obviously, with China, is trying to work out which horse to back here. It doesn't really want to back Russia fully for all sorts of reasons. I think Viktor Orban's an interesting one because Hungary took up the presidency of the EU just at the start of this month, and yet Orban didn't ask Europe, didn't take any advice before he went to speak to Putin, and therefore appeared to go there on behalf of the EU, offering a sort of olive branch to act as a negotiator, which I'm not quite sure what Viktor Orban's actual agenda was there. What was interesting that flowed out of that meeting, though, up till now, Putin has regularly said on media, I'm ready to negotiate. It's the West that's not able to negotiate. He made very clear after Orban's visit, I am not going to negotiate. And the truth of the matter, James, again, as a student of history, people only negotiate once one side has won or one side has lost, or they've ground themselves to a stalemate, and it's actually probably in everybody's interest to call a halt. At the moment on the front line, Russia is on the front foot. It clearly hasn't achieved its objectives of the special military operation. And until it does, it's very difficult to see that President Putin will be in any mood whatsoever, particularly if he thinks that President Trump's going to come to the table and a very different approach may happen. So, no, I don't think there's any appetite at all from Russia for negotiating anytime soon.
Sean Bell, always great to get your insight and your analysis. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you, James.
Thank you for watching Frontline for Times Radio. For more on global security and the war in Ukraine, you can listen to Times Radio, take out a digital subscription to the Times, and click subscribe on our YouTube channel.